Okay, so we've taken a look at African civilizations. We've taken a look at the Middle Passage, so the next step is into the Americas. And so we'll take a look at the landing and sail with a focus on the West Indies or the Caribbean. So before arrival, so as they're getting closer on the Middle Passage, as they get closer to the West Indies, slaves would be allowed to shave. They would start to be washed with fresh water instead of salt water, and they'd be given more exercise as they get closer and closer to their new destination. Slaves, once they are in the West Indies, on this next step in the Caribbean, and they'd be allowed to rest for several weeks on some of the smaller islands before their next destination. And so the French would use one of the tiny islands, Martinique. The British would use the Barbados as their kind of resting stops before their next stop. And slave captains would use this time to start to negotiate with some of the agents of the large plantations, the planters, across the Americas to find the best deals. So as people are recovering from the Middle Passage, the captain's making his deals, as they're often housed in these houses like this. The captain's making his deals. Preparation for sail. And so the negative effects of the Middle Passage, the cruelty, the confinement, and disease, needed to be reduced or hidden for sail. And so they'd use little tricks like they would dye any graying hair, as people would go prematurely gray, and they'd go gray in their 20s from going through that horrific experience. They would often oil the bodies to try to hide injuries that were sustained along the Middle Passage. Once they go to market, we're going to get really, really close inspections from possible buyers. It's very inhumane, treating the people like animals. And unless a purchaser would buy an entire cargo, which happened for the big plantations, we'd have auctions on the ship, where people would be brought up one by one, or in the sail yards on shore. On occasion, we'd get something that's quite barbaric, the scramble, where some captains would just set prices for all men, women, and children, and they really were trying to just get rid of everybody as fast as possible. And so they would just allow buyers to rush in and rope up anybody they wanted like cattle. The next step, once they are bought, once they've had rest for a few weeks, is seasoning. And this is a period of up to 2 years where planters are going to adjust their slaves to their new culture and break them into plantation routines. And so this is kind of the next step, this training to become a slave, and how they're going to try to break them down. Slaves would be divided into 3 major categories. We have Creoles, and that is anybody that's born in the Americas. Creole is a tricky word. We're going to see multiple different definitions over the next few months. But in this case, it's anybody that's born in the Americas. They are much more highly valued because in most cases they're already broken in. They already understand American culture. Old Africans, these are people that have lived in the Americas for a while. They're already trained, but they weren't born into this society, so they remember Africa. And then we have New Africans, people that have just arrived. They're not trained and probably a little rebellious and not ready for life as a slave in the Americas. So first stop is the West Indies. In many cases, unless they're going directly to Brazil, they're going to go to the West Indies if they're going to go to the rest of America. And so they would often apprentice on sugar plantations, which is very easy to grow in the Caribbean. And then they would be, once they've been trained and seasoned as a solid worker, they would be resold to American planters after seasoning. Most slaves who went to America before 1720 would spend time in the West Indies first for this seasoning. But after 1720, because of increased demands on both sides, in that the United States, well, before the United States, but North America, they had an increased demand for slaves that the West Indies couldn't keep up. And the West Indies wanted to keep their own slaves as well to increase production for sugar. And so after 1720, we start to see direct shipments of slaves directly into North America instead of stopping off in the Caribbean. Or they'd go directly to the Caribbean, as we just saw this increased demand for things like sugar and tobacco. Seasoning was meant to change the attitude of slaves and make them into more effective workers, and so their entire life's going to be changed. And so they're going to be given new names. Their old African names will be taken, and they're going to get new names, Christian names, sometimes African names, but not necessarily their African names, or sometimes even Greco-Roman names based on mythology. So they'll get names like Zeus or Jupiter. And so they're going to be renamed, and we saw a little bit of that in Roots, the Kunta Kinte to Toby. They'd have to learn a completely new language, these European languages. Spanish masters were incredibly thorough in teaching the language, and so in most cases their Spanish was pretty solid after a while. The French and English masters, not so much. They're going to be a little less thorough, and so this resulted in a Creole dialect that mixed African languages with French and or English. And so we start to get this example of language mixing. We have a couple examples that are still present today. And so in America, especially along Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, you get the language of Gullah, which is a mix of English and African dialects. In modern day Haiti, they don't speak French, and they're not speaking African languages. They're speaking a mix, which is known as Creole, another definition for Creole. And so they speak Creole in Haiti. And then later on in class, I'll bring out an example of some Gullah books to kind of show you. It's very easy to read, but there's just some slight differences. The overseers would work to break the slaves in the plantation work by assigning them into specific work gangs. And so we get several different types of gangs, several different types of work. The first gang would be the strongest men for the heavy field work of planting, harvesting. So the tough work is going to go to the big guys. We'll have the second gang. This is women, older men, for lighter field work. So this is going to be like weeding and some of the kind of helping out with the heavy stuff. Third gang is going to be the children, which as soon as they can walk, they can work. And so they're going to work shorter hours, and they're going to work to kind of help maintain the first two crews by bringing out food and water to the field gangs. Other slaves would become domestic servants. They become house slaves, and we'll talk more about the difference therein. New Africans would serve as apprenticeships with old Africans from their same ethnic group, or possibly with Creoles. And we saw a bit of that in Roots, as Kunta Kinte is working with Fiddler as kind of this trainer, this apprentice. Younger slaves would be preferred in most cases, as they're going to be more easy to adapt to this new situation as opposed to older Africans. Old Africans and Creoles were used as trainers because instead of whites, because whites were the minority in the Caribbean over time. And so they'd use African trainers, and slaves would be training slaves. And we get this somewhat in the American South as well. African customs of shared labor became the norm, and African working traditions were brought over. The drivers and people that were leading these gangs most often were black because, again, whites were a minority over time in the Caribbean. And so they would direct the work of the gangs and would often carry whips and would punish dissent, kind of encourage the work. There are benefits to this apprentice system in that all slaves, the master would give some food, but slaves were often given tiny chunks of land, little plots of land, to grow their own food. And so this would kind of help benefit their diet. And so they get some food from master, but they also get to grow their own food. And so whatever they grow, they're going to eat a little bit better. And if they have extra food, this surplus food, on certain days during the weekend or during the week, they could be sold at market to earn money towards buying freedom. So if they're able to grow a whole bunch of extra corn, they could sell it at market, stack up their money to eventually buy their freedom or somebody else's freedom. And so slave instructors, and now that they are now kind of helping to apprentice somebody, they get that extra work. And by having extra workers, they're going to be able to produce more surplus food. New Africans would also learn how to build a new style of home, a little bit different than in Africa. They would learn how to grow food for a market so that one day they as well could work to get their freedom. And in many cases, they're going to bring these skills from Africa. They already knew this. But those that weren't farmers or builders in Africa definitely going to learn this new skill, but many already were farmers, especially the rice farmers that were imported into the South Carolinas. New Africans would learn how to adapt to this new climate, new topography, building materials, social organization. So through this apprenticeship, they're kind of getting and understanding this new life that's been forced upon them. And so how did they know when seasoning's over? How do they know that it worked out? One is, well, did they live? Did they survive? A lot of people were going to be weakened from disease, from the Middle Passage, and the trauma of the Middle Passage, and they just didn't survive seasoning. And so they're already weak from the journey, and they don't survive the first couple months. And number two, they were able to adapt to this new food and climate, and that they're going to be eating a lot more fish from New England. They're going to start to eat Indian corn, American style of squashes that aren't available in Africa. Caribbean, so as far as food, they got to be able to adapt to this new style of food. And the Caribbean islands are going to be more tropical like Africa, so the weather is similar. But in North America, if you're getting into the South, or even as far as New York, Boston, it's going to be much colder, so you have to adapt to this new environment. Another big idea is that they're going to have to learn a new language. This could be English, French, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese. And so slaves had to speak a Creole dialect in many cases well enough to obey commands. So if they didn't learn perfect English, they had to know enough just to get by. So there's a little gullah joke. But also psychologically, they have to prepare for this complete change in their lives. Many would commit suicide, but most would eventually accept this new horrible status and separation from their homes. New Africans that lost their families often made new bonds with shipmates on the Middle Passage to create these kind of new extended families, and they'd create new families according to their plantations that they were now going to be part of. Behavior was modified, but a lot of times these cultural roots would be maintained by getting to know and working together. And so they're never going to be completely changed. They're all going to have little bits and pieces of Africa to create something that's new. It's a new African-American culture that's not 100% of Africa or America. It's going to be this new blend, similar to these Creole languages like Gullah. The cruelty of the slave trade led to its eventual abolition in the early 19th century, and this really starts to be pushed by English abolitionists led by Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, know that name, William Wilberforce, as well as Granville Sharp in the late 1700s. And they started to use a religious-oriented moral crusade against slavery and the slave trade. So if you have a chance, I really recommend watching Amazing Grace to kind of push how this works, how they're going to use this religious argument, this moral argument, to push against slavery. Now, even though they had this religious argument, it always comes down to economics. It came down to business, and that's the real cause of this change. England had dominated the slave trade since 1713, and they became the focus of their main efforts. If they can change England, they're going to change the whole thing. People were angry about the cruelty of slavery. They had this moral outrage. This was only a minor cause of the end. England's economy over time had become less dependent on the slave trade and the plantation system. They started to move to a more industrial, capitalist style of economy. And they were just less dependent on slavery. And they got the Industrial Revolution from the money they gained from slavery, and with the Industrial Revolution they're starting to turn to machines instead. And so this change encourages investment in machines and factories and trade as opposed to investing in slavery. This new method will be getting raw materials from the Americas and the world, and markets for its manufactured goods is just going to make more money. And so they start to realize the slave trade's not going to make so much money now that they really have a system set up with plantations already in the Americas, especially what will become the United States. And they're not talking about getting rid of slavery necessarily, but the slave trade is just not making as much money anymore. And so they decide to outlaw the slave trade in 1807. The British Navy begins to patrol the African coast to enforce this ban on other nations, to kind of encourage everybody to stop the slave trade. Not slavery, but the slave trade. The U.S. also outlaws the trade in 1808. Some American, Brazilian, and Spanish slavers would continue the trade, but this trade really starts to drop significantly. Surprisingly enough, some of the coastal African kingdoms of Guinea and Western Central Africa, really Congo, they pushed to try to keep the trade going because their entire economy was now based on slavery and the slave trade. And so by ending the slave trade, they're really hurting their economy. So they were trying to really keep the slave trade going, but it just wasn't making money for England. So England pretty much cut it out. And so we started to see the establishment of forts along the coast. The English, the French, the Belgians, and the Portuguese start to establish a fort to prevent the slave trade. But this also becomes an excuse for imperialism, where they just start to carve up Africa and take it as a new form of slavery, a new form where they're just taking over land for raw materials and for trade. So they trade one evil for another.